And this is we have a really special privilege. And I know we've had GDS last week, and we had Dr. John Viola on Sunday, but Rice is going to be speaking tonight, and then he'll be speaking Sunday, and then next Wednesday again. So this is a three-part series. And Rice is a retired seminary professor from Faith Theological Seminary in Baltimore. And I've known Rice my whole life, or he's known me my whole life. And Rice is a graduate of Dallas Seminary. And what I'd say about Rice, my entire life of knowing him, he is one individual that has always been an incredible man of grace. My entire life. And I have been a recipient of Rice's grace for 46 years and now counting. So please welcome Rice, and he's going to talk to us about something very important. Okay?
Well, thank you, Jeffrey. Jeffrey's father and I were in seminary together, and the family has been close ever since. Background there. Now, I'm just going to read the first sentence on this handout that we have. Oh, one other thing. I can guarantee you tonight, we will have technical problems. Jeff has been my technical advisor, but it's so hard to work between North Carolina and Idaho. So things have gotten very bad. Now, I'd like a show of hands here. How many people are familiar with dispensationalism? By a show of hands, familiar? The 7 dispensations, you know, innocence and promise, etc. How many people feel that dispensationalism up to this point has been important in your life? Oh, not too many hands. But this first sentence says this: for about 200 years, traditional dispensationalism has been one of the best approaches to the interpretation of the Bible. But today, in 2018, traditional dispensationalism must be upgraded and clarified to biblical dispensationalism in order to correctly understand God's Word, the Bible. So I'm just convinced that if this subject has not been on your main screen up until now, that if we understand biblical dispensationalism, we will discover it's very practical. It's something we need to know before we die and go to be with the Lord, because it tells us certain things that we need to accomplish during our lifetime. Now, tonight is a preliminary. Biblical worldview is a very popular subject in speeches and things like that. And I think it's a good idea to warm up with that subject. But we will be taking part 2 on Sunday night, I think, and then part 3 on next Wednesday night. And I think we'll just get started with the preliminaries, biblical worldview. I use the word biblical because I believe that you need to add a biblical dimension to almost any aspect of the Christian life and ministry. And it's when we get away from the Bible that we get into trouble. And I think we'll see how that unfolds. Okay. Now, one of the things as we read the New Testament, we see that Jesus was in constant conflict with the religious and national authorities of his day. The scribes, the Pharisees, the Sanhedrin, the ruling class of Israel. and the king and all that. And so one day the Pharisees and Sadducees came to test Jesus, demanding that he show them a miraculous sign from heaven to prove his authority. And Jesus replied, "You can read the weather signs, but you don't understand the spiritual signs, the end of the age, the signs of the times, and things of that nature." Now, Jesus was in conflict with the religious authorities of Israel from the very time that he announced his public ministry. From the time that John the Baptist introduced Jesus as the forerunner, they were on Jesus' case until the end of his public ministry. Now, we have these three divisions of what we'd like to share with you. Biblical worldview tonight, biblical dispensations next, and then finally biblical commissions. Let's just deal with our personal worldview. It's very likely that you haven't given a lot of thought to your personal worldview, but a worldview is the total of our individual beliefs about the world, the big picture that directs and influences our duties and responsibilities, daily decisions and activities. Worldview is how one views the world. Worldview is a matter of viewpoint. It's also a matter of what life really means. What's it all about? You know, we're born, we're a child, we're a teenager, young adult, senior, and you finally get to my stage. The meaning and significance of life is a very serious matter, and a lot of people don't give much attention to it. It's not easy, but it's very important. I want to tell you about an incident that when you're in college, you try to get a good summer job. And one summer in college, I got a summer job at a mental hospital. And it was a good job, but I really felt sympathy for the people at the hospital. So my first day on the job, a large day room, men, to separate the men and the women and the children at this big mental institution. A lot of tables, round tables, seating about 4 or 5 people all across this day room. It's my first day on the job. And I noticed a table up close that the men were playing cards, dealing out the cards, and they spend a lot of time doing that. And a staff member, a fellow staff member with some experience, maybe trying to impress me, I don't know, but in a mental institution, you have a big set of keys because every door is locked. And so this guy, this staff member, comes along with his big set of keys, and he walks by these 5 guys playing cards, and he takes his keys and lays it on the table and keeps on walking. Now he's kind of showing off. I understand it because I do dumb things like that myself. Well, this one guy, mentally ill, playing cards, he looks down at the keys, picks them up, and heads for the door. And very quickly unlocks the door, and he's gone. And now this guy is really concerned. But I found out about this guy who was, of course, found and brought back. He had a mental snap. The last sentence that he ever said was, "What's the meaning of it?" And from that time until the present, at that time, he never said anything else but that sentence. What's the meaning of it? So apparently he had some crisis in his life, and he just kind of snapped and ended up in a mental hospital. And I use that illustration just to say how important it is for us to understand the meaning and significance of our lives. Now, human viewpoints and worldviews deal with these kind of subjects. There's human viewpoints, popular, personal, divine, and biblical worldviews. And our goal is a divine or biblical worldview. The way we look at things, we like to be biblical. Now, worldviews often are oriented to be religious, secular, scientific, atheism, agnosticism, theism, and Judeo-Christianity. We could spend a lot of time with all the various hundreds and hundreds of distinctive worldviews. Now, we're going to zero right in quickly to what is our worldview here, Judeo-Christianity. Now, none of the major religions can really compete with Judeo-Christianity. It embraces all of earth history, from the beginning of the heavens and earth in Genesis 1:1, all the way to the new heavens and new earth, Revelation 20, 21, 22, and everything in between. It's just rock solid historically, archaeologically, ancient history documents, etc., etc. So we're in the area of Judeo-Christianity. Now, we limit it to these areas because they're so obviously superior to other choices. Although we have to be careful saying that it's not politically correct to say something like that. But back in the beginning, we had Gentile faith in God. This would be the time of Noah, Enoch, Adam and Eve. They were Gentiles. Most of us here tonight are Gentiles. And they had faith in God. The next turning point was with the call of Abraham. And Abraham would be the first Hebrew, first Jewish person. And Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, these would be examples of Hebrew faith in God. And then Jesus comes along, and we have a Judeo-Christianity that has all of our Christian, all of our faith history from the beginning until the New Testament. Now, in New Testament times, there was a major split when the Jewish people rejected their Messiah. There was that New Testament period, say from 33 to 36 AD, in which back and forth Jesus was preaching and teaching, and people were believing in him or rejecting him. But then there was the split, and Judaism went off on its own and was comprised of those who did not accept Jesus as the Messiah. Now, those that did accept Jesus as the Messiah are described mostly in the book of Acts. But something happened. It's a little difficult, I think, for normal church-going people to understand this. But let me see if I can put it this way. Adam and Eve had the advantage in the garden of fellowship with God. God walked in the garden. They walked and talked together. And God set a standard and a test for Adam and Eve. And it was, don't partake of this tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You have this wonderful garden. You have all variety of fruit and food, and God's presence and fellowship. But the stipulation, you can do almost anything, but don't transgress this line. Well, we did. And the history history of the first 2,000 years, mostly in Mesopotamia, was that people became rather evil. And it got so bad that eventually God says, enough, I'm going to start over. I'm going to have the flood, and we're going to start over. So there was the flood in Noah's time. After the flood, there were just 8 people, starting all over again, just like there were 2 in the garden, now there are 8 after the flood. And in the next 200 to 300 years, mankind was as evil as before the flood. And God's mandate to the human race at that time was to populate and care for the earth and cover the earth. But they refused to do that. They said, no, we're going to settle in an area that's known as Babylon. We're going to build a tower, reaches into the heaven, and we're not going to obey the mandate. Well, there's a new teaching, new to me, and I'll ask you, how many of you have heard of this? It has to do with the divine counsel of spirit beings. How many of you have heard anything about that? Not too many. Well, I'll tell some stories as I go along, as I'm thinking about the times that John Stevens and I were in seminary. People go to seminary to get training for the ministry. And one of their major goals is to learn Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. Because if you don't have access to these basic languages that the original scriptures were written in and the original players spoke, etc., you're at a big disadvantage. Well, there's a guy that I've come across in at least the last couple years. His name is Michael Heiser, and he's written some blockbuster books. One title would be The Unseen Realm, all about angels, spirits, this type of thing. The other book that's a big blockbuster is called Reversing Mount Hermon. Now, there are some things that qualified biblical scholars can deal with that the ordinary Christian, including pastors and others, do not have access to. And this young man, as a young man, while he's in seminary, was challenged by his professors to have a fresh look at Psalm 82. So if you have your Bible, I want you to turn to Psalm 82. And he saw something there that he had never seen before. And it opened a whole new realm for him. Psalm 82. Now I'm reading from the Names of God Bible. The characteristic of which is it preserves the original names of God rather than just using the term Lord or God. It tells you what is in the original text. So in Psalm 82, it's a very short psalm. Just read part of it. Psalm 82. What's your first word? God. Okay, now my first word is Elohim takes his place in his own assembly. He pronounces judgment among the gods. Now that's an accurate translation into English. King James and the New King James, they don't have the accurate translation of many, many terms like this. Oh, we lost something, Jeff. Did I do that myself? I bet I did. Well, Jeff will fix it. That's my motto for years. It says, he, Elohim, pronounces judgment among the gods. Now what we have here, just briefly, just to touch upon this and move on, there was a time when there was only God. Now, human beings are limited, of course, all of us understand that. The one thing that we cannot comprehend as a human being with our brain, etc., is how God always has been there. The eternality of God. He's always been there. We're not able to handle that. And we have these limitations. But now, my thought is that we are coming to a time in which the Bible calls it the end times, the last days. We look around us. We look at North Korea. We look at nuclear bombs. And we look at the hostility between nations. And we look at the prophecies of the Bible. And we can tell that something is up, something big. Now, we might ask ourselves, what's wrong with the world? What's wrong with the world, and what can we do about it? We mentioned, thanks, Jeff. We mentioned how.
Yeah, I'm going to just move you over here.
Yeah, sure.
Because your mic keeps cutting out.
Oh, okay.
And if it keeps doing that, we may need to have you move up top here.
Yeah, that'd be fine. You want to do that?
Just go ahead and just do that.
Well, I like to be close down here, but
Well, if you give this a try.
okay. And the first time it doesn't work again, we'll go up top. Okay. Now, I'm going to give you just a real quick snapshot of something that's will be treated in detail much later. Let's look at the first 2,000 years of human history, mostly played out in Mesopotamia, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Iran, those Middle Eastern areas. These were the Gentiles. This was the Gentile period. And the Gentiles turned evil. Now, this passage about Elohim creating the heavens and earth, Elohim meeting with a council, and there's a second reference to Elohim in that Psalm, Psalm 82. One has a capital letter, Elohim, capital letter. That's the Most High God. The other Elohim is with a small letter, E. These are the spirit beings that God created. In other words, our eternal God, we can hardly visualize in times everlastingly past when there was only God. And then there came a time when God made a move. The first creation was of spirit beings. God is a spirit. No one has seen the Father. He's spirit. And he created other spirit beings. And at the end of that first 2,000 years, when humankind, well, maybe let's go back just a minute before we touch upon that. First there was God only. Then God created these Elohim, small letter E, spirit beings. Then God created the universe. And the book of Job says that these small letter Elohims, these spirit beings, sang and were impressed with awe when God, the Most High God, Elohim, capital E, when he created the universe. These spirit beings were there. Well, then some time passes, and God decides and shares with these other spirit beings, he's going to create the human race. Now, it's possible that some of these spirit beings, these Elohim, mentioned many times in the Old Testament, not just in Psalm 82, maybe there was a disagreement. Maybe there was a little rebellion. Maybe some spirit beings didn't want God to create the human race, and they rebelled. And notice in the Garden of Eden, before Adam and Eve fell, And at the time when God would walk with them in the garden, there was another entity there in the garden, watching Adam and Eve, and that was Satan. Now, I've heard over a long lifetime a lot of criticism of the Bible. People reject the Bible and they do it grossly, unfairly, they misrepresent, and they talk about, yeah, the Bible, you know, about the snake, the talking snake, and the animals lining up to go into Noah's Ark, and they just don't consider it very carefully. But actually, you got to go deeper. If you see a problem, you've got to think about it and look and see if there are explanations. Now, this gentleman that I referred to that writes about the unseen world, he points out that the word for Satan is nakash. I say that just because I remember it, you know. And it means a luminary. So it's very possible, I think I can tell it, the sound not recorded when I moved over there, right? It could be that we've misunderstood much of the Bible, like a talking snake, like the animals lining up in a line, like you see in children's books and like critics like to refer to. This was a luminous being that talked to Adam and Eve. This was something that once you understand it, the problem resolves itself. Satan's one of these Elohim. He's a spirit being created by God and rebelled. And not only rebelled, persuaded other spirit beings to be on his side. And once you get into looking for answers rather than being critical, it opens up a whole spiritual world. In other words, my principle is you don't criticize God and you don't criticize the Bible. What you do is you have a problem, you look to resolve it. Now, today there are thousands of major Christian denominations, thousands. And there are many more organizations that are all different from one another. Methodist, Presbyterian, Church of Christ, what have you, Mormons, many different kinds. Now, it's been my thought that if we took the Bible with all the things in the Bible that are clear, and that's most of the Bible, it's clear. You understand, you know. Paul took a ship, traveled from one place to another place, went to the synagogue, preached. It's all very clear. There are other passages that are not so clear. Now, my thought is, if we would want more unity among ourselves as Christians worldwide, what we would do is we would accept all those clear passages, probably 85% of the Bible, and say, here we all believe this, it's all true, it's supported by evidence, history, archaeology, etc. Now here's another 15% that's unclear. We just don't know what that means. Okay, don't build a denomination on those unclear passages. So we don't have such division that we lose our impact with the world. By the way, I thought I would like to throw in at this point, all across the world, especially in Great Britain and America, we have a decline in Christianity. In Great Britain, England, Scotland, Wales, the fastest growing religion is, what do you think? Islam. In America, the church has been in decline for a long time. And the fastest growing church in America is also Islam. Well, I really started that little point too quickly. I'll come back to that later. Now let's see what we got here. Freedom of religion. We have an election. What is tonight? Election night? The 6th.
Halloween.
Right, the 6th is election night. Now, I made it a point to do a preliminary, what do you call them? One of those, vote early, you know. So I have voted. I am really concerned about the political situation. If the Democratic Party had won the last election, we'd be up to our ears in trouble. And if they win this one in 2020, we're going to be up to our ears again. But anyhow, there's an overlap between politics and religion, Christianity, Christ. So you can't just say, well, no, we're not into politics. You've got to be into politics. But be careful, each one of us, on how we handle that, and be sure to vote. Now, I'm going to go a little further here. Well, I'm going to say something about this freedom of religion thing. America is known as one of the pioneer countries in freedom of religion. I'm thinking of the Pilgrims, the Puritans, all those Christian people that ventured out on the Atlantic Ocean in those ancient ships, risking everything so that they could worship God as they pleased. They came here for freedom of religion. Now, it's amazing to think that in that day, in those times, England was so rigidly Catholic at first, and then Anglican. You know, the king requested permission from the Pope for a divorce, and he couldn't get it. So he said, okay, you're out, I'm in. And the Roman Catholic Church in England became the Church of England over those grounds. Well, the Church of England was very, very non-freedom oriented. And they would actually burn dissenters at the stake or put them in the tower, etc. So many Puritans, Pilgrims, left England, went to Holland for a while, and found that their children were becoming Dutch, and decided they're going to venture to America. And they came over. Jamestown, 1607. Plymouth, what? 20, right. But they didn't bring freedom of religion. They brought freedom for themselves to practice their religion, but if you weren't a Puritan, if you were a Catholic, a Jewish person, a Quaker, you could be killed in Puritan land, and many were. But I have three favorite persons in the colonial period, and one of them was Roger Williams. Now, how many know about Roger Williams? A lot of people don't. Roger Williams was the first person to speak of in history who believed in freedom of conscience. And he founded Rhode Island as a haven for anybody. You could be Catholic, Quaker, anything, and you could become a citizen in Rhode Island. He was the first one to have freedom of conscience. That didn't mean that he believed that all these different viewpoints were equally of value. No, he was a Christian and a good one. But he believed that every individual has freedom of will and freedom of conscience, and what you believe, you don't be persecuted for it. But there are consequences. The other two of my favorite colonial personalities was Captain John Smith. I know you've all heard of him. Captain John Smith, one of the most courageous historical people ever. He grew up in England, John Smith did, and he was an adventurer from the get-go. He ran away from home. His father had to track him down, bring him back. But when his father died, John Smith headed for Europe as a mercenary soldier, young guy. And before he went, he prepared himself. He knew all about weapons. He got a horse trainer to train him to use horses in a military way. He was a great guy. And he joined the Dutch army to fight for their freedom from Spain. This was, you know, back in those 1500s. And then he came back home and returned to Europe and joined up with an Eastern Europe group that were fighting, of all things, Muslims. Now, the first Americans to deal with Islam were people like Captain John Smith, Thomas Jefferson, Madison, John Adams, John Quincy Adams. They formed the Marines to deal with the Muslims attacking our shipping from America to Europe, etc., etc. And they would take over a ship and they would put the American sailors in slave situations, sell them, etc. So that's been going on a long time. And also, I mentioned that before, I really should have. That comes up later. But that was a freedom of choice. Roger Williams, a great patriot, Captain John Smith. And the third person that I really admire, Pocahontas. Not the Pocahontas that President Trump refers to, but the real Pocahontas, a Native American who welcomed the people at Jamestown and became a Christian herself. And then freedom of will. Now this is a very powerful freedom. We all have it, and it accounts for our problems, most of our problems. It's the reason that Adam and Eve could fall. It's the reason that Satan and other spirit beings could rebel against God. It's the reason that you can become addicted to drugs. It's the reason that some people do this and do that, etc. It's that will. And there are truth and consequences based on our use of the will and our actions, etc. Now, on this point, I'd like to point out something that has been an intrigue for me a long time. We talked about the Gentile who had faith in God in the pre-flood times, like Noah, like Methuselah, like Enoch. And then there was Abraham. Now, there's a story behind the choosing of Abraham I'd like to just touch upon. When the human race became so evil that the book of Genesis says that God repented that he had created them and decided to send the flood. Start all over with Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives, 8 people. In 300 years, they were just as evil as they were before the flood. Now, remember how we looked at Psalm 82, and we saw something there about Elohim with a capital E and Elohim plural with a small e. Now, this gentleman that I refer to, Heiser, went away to prepare for the ministry. He went to secular universities that had very strong language departments. And University of Wisconsin, he got one of his doctorates, and University of Pennsylvania, other places. And he and others have pioneered looking into the text of the Old and New Testament and seeing evidences of the spirit world. He's the author of The Unseen Realm. And he's the author of Reversing Hermon. Now, I want to say a word about reversing Hermon. Hermon now is a mountain in northern Israel. Mount Hermon, the tallest mountain in northern Israel. When people tried to answer the question that we started with, what's wrong with the world and what can we do about it? Most people think of Genesis 3 and the fall of Adam and Eve, and Cain and Abel and the other. But Heiser says it's not just Genesis 3, but it's also Genesis 6. Now, Genesis 6 tells a very strange story. It tells of a time when some of these spirit beings intermarried with human women. It's very understandable. Once you see the nature of our world today, 2018, and we see all of the sex trafficking, immorality, same-sex marriage, it rings a bell when Genesis 6 explains how that there was this mixing of the spirit beings and human beings and the resultant Nephilim. And the Nephilim were some of the renowned people of early human history, like Nimrod, like Goliath, who fought with David. Just think, David, as a young man, going to visit his brothers on a battlefield with the Philistines, and he sees this giant Goliath challenging the Israeli army. And David was a special kind of person. Remember, a man after God's own heart. And David says to himself, as a young guy, a teenager, late teen, why is this pagan challenging God? And Goliath was down there, had moved out from the camp, and challenged the army to send down somebody. And he says, look, we'll just have a duel between me and whoever you want to send down, and winner take all, etc. Well, David says, I'll go, I'll do it. But when you think about it, David is in the messianic line for the Messiah. And Goliath is a descendant of the Nephilim, spirit beings from the outer space, almost, you might want to say. What would have happened if Goliath, with all of his armor, his big spear, and all shield and all that, had killed David? That was the messianic line, would have been broken right there. But that didn't happen because David beat Goliath. Now, one theme that, if you want to understand the New Testament, I think you have to deal with is what happened when the nation Israel rejected their Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth. There was a parting of the ways. Up until that time, you'd think of finding the truth about God in the nation Israel, you know, with all of Israel's history, etc., all the great men of faith in Israel. But there came this split, so that today, if you would take a trip to Israel, you would find that the cop on the corner directing traffic, the baker, the people at the hospital, everybody is non-Christian. Very, very interesting. Now, when I finished seminary, I got a marvelous opportunity to be a chaplain in a school in Jerusalem. So I got a chance to go to Israel and study in Jerusalem, and notice up front that people in Israel are not Christian. They're Jewish. And at our institute, the American Institute of Holy Land Studies, it was called then, it's called something else now, we would have very famous Israeli leaders from the cabinet and others come and speak to our student group. It's a small group, but a very privileged group. And one of the professors was from Hebrew University. And his specialty was the Dead Sea Scrolls, mostly. And he also had a reputation of being very friendly with Christians, which is a little unusual. And he was giving a lecture to the students about the Dead Sea Scrolls and other things with a slight Christian tilt to them. And in the Q&A period, questions, he had touched upon some similarities between Judaism and Christianity. And I, being sort of impetuous all my life, addressed this world-famous person and referred to something that he had talked about in his lecture about similarities between Judaism and Christianity. And I said something, if that's true, what about the claims of Jesus as fulfilling these things that you've mentioned that are similar? And I'll never forget this guy. I came to know him a little bit. If you are a highly visible person in Israel, you're a little careful about alliance with Christians. And he kind of leaned over and says, "What do you want from me?" And I said, "Oh my goodness, I'm in big trouble, you know." And it turns out, I think that he is, or was, a Christian guy. Oh, I think it might fell off. Oh, it might fell off. What do you think, Jeff? Okay. Right, thanks a lot. Now, if you can just straighten out my mental process. That's what I really need here. Anyhow, we were talking about this split, and it's in reality today. Israel, as a nation, is one of our closest allies, but they're not Christians. And we have a very sympathetic attitude toward Israel because of their history. David and Samuel and all those Christians. Well, I think we'll move on to this. The bottom line in the discussions that we'll have, the next two, they center in God. Who is Jesus? What is God's personal name? How can there be a Trinity or Godhead? Is the Bible fact or fiction? Just a couple comments there. The more a Christian studies the Bible, the more he sees the significance of Jesus. We underestimate God. We underestimate Jesus. We underestimate the Holy Spirit. We're very queasy about the Trinity. Now, my thought at this point in my life is that the Trinity, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, is the most unique factor of all the major religions. No religion has this Trinity. Why is there a Trinity? It's a mystery we cannot totally grasp. But you cannot have love within the Godhead without multiple persons. God is love. God is Father. God is Son. God is Holy Spirit. God is one. It's a mystery. You don't understand how God always was, and we don't understand the Trinity. But it's our strongest point in making a worldview. Christianity is unique in being involved in the Trinity. Now, we'll come across another reference there later. There are three passages that to me are outstanding to go back to again and again. I just want to refer to them. I think I'll take them in reverse order. The three visitors. You remember the situation in ancient Israel when Abraham and Sarah were in a I forget the geographical area, but they had a tent, and it was a hot day, and it was high noon. And Abraham sees in the near distance 3 men approaching. Well, one of the things about the ancient world was this business of hospitality. Abraham is up on his feet. He greets them and says, here, they're in an oak grove for shade and all that. He says, gentlemen, have a rest here. I'll get you some water. We'll wash your feet, we'll have a meal, etc. Now, these three gentlemen were very, very unique. One was an angel, second one was an angel, and the third one was the angel of Yahweh, the angel of God, Christ in his pre-incarnate form and being. And the passage makes that clear. It's not guesswork. So they get their feet washed, they get a nice meal, and the two men set off in the direction of Sodom. And Abraham is kind of like you would walk people to the end of the property or to the door or whatever. Abraham is with this third person. And the third person says, should I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? And what he was about to do, he was sending these two angels to Sodom to investigate the situation and to destroy it. And Abraham has a discourse with this person who seems to be a man, but he's really God the Son in his pre-incarnate form. And Abraham knows that his nephew Lot and his wife and their two daughters, they live in Sodom. So he says, Lord, forgive me, but would you destroy the righteous with the unrighteous in Sodom? And they bargain. They start with about 50. I think they get down to 10. And this third person, who is divine, says, no, if we find that there are 10 righteous people in Sodom, we will not destroy it. But the point of the passage to me is that God is coming down to the level of Abraham as a human being and conversing with him and being serious about it, taking him very seriously. Now, the next one is the burning bush. This is another one of my favorite passages. Moses lived his first 40 years in Egypt, grew up in the palace, the Pharaoh's palace, and knew that his own people, who had been in a privileged position for a long time, having come down in the time of Joseph and Jacob. The story of Joseph is incredible as well, but we'll deal with that later. Burning bush, yeah. He goes out to see how his own countrymen are doing. And he finds an Egyptian who is mistreating a Hebrew. By this time, the Hebrews, who under Joseph and Jacob were very well treated in the best of the land of Egypt, but now several hundred years have gone by, and a Pharaoh arises who has no care for that and sees this group of Hebrews in the delta of Egypt as a potential threat. And Moses knows that when word gets out, and word was out, that he had killed an Egyptian, the Pharaoh would have his life. So he flees Egypt, and he goes to a country called Midian. And he marries the daughter of a priest, which is an interesting thing. The priest of Midian, not an Israelite, not part of Old Testament religion under Abraham, but a Midian high priest. Moses marries one of his daughters and has for 40 years been working with this guy and tending sheep, flocks, etc. So one day, at 80 years of age, he's with the flocks, on the west side of the desert, and he sees a bush burning and not being consumed. Strong flame, bush green. And he goes over to get a closer look. And God speaks to Moses. These incidents in which there's contact between God and a human being are so interesting. And God speaks there, the burning bush, and says, Moses. And Moses says, I'm here. And soon we find out that the angel of the Lord is there and speaks to Moses out of the burning bush. Tells Moses to take off his sandals, that he's on holy ground. And he gives Moses a commission. He says, I heard the cries of the Israelites being mistreated in Egypt, and I want you to go to Pharaoh and demand, set my people free. We want to go out, worship the Lord in the desert, in the wilderness, and I'm going to bring them on to the promised land. Well, when this happens, and this happens a number of times in the Old Testament, usually the person is a little reluctant. Moses says, who am I, to go to Pharaoh? Who am I to lead out the Israelites? And God says, I'll be with you, and he goes through the staff, turns the staff into a snake and things like that. Moses is not convinced. Moses says, listen, if I go to the Israelites and say, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has spoken to me and he sent me to lead you out of Egypt. Suppose they say, what's his name? What am I going to say? God had not revealed his personal name to this point. And God says, tell them that I am is sending me to you. And I suppose Moses was rocked back on his heels, and God continues on and says, just tell them that I am who I am has sent me to you. And of course we know the Exodus story. By the way, on the Exodus, back at Jeffrey's place, Josh and I were watching a film about the Exodus, and it showed us that people today, even the most prominent rabbi in America, Wolpe, Rabbi Wolpe, W-O-L-P-E, does not believe the Exodus happened. And then they went to major archaeologists from Israel, England, and other places, and they said, right, the Exodus never happened, there's no evidence for it. However, there are scholars who support and defend and explore and study the situation, and there's a good, strong case for all of the Bible, including the Exodus. Now, if you get a chance, you can go on the internet or YouTube or Amazon, and the name of this DVD is Patterns of Evidence, Exodus. And there is a filmmaker, American filmmaker from Minnesota. His name is Timothy Mahoney. And he did this incredibly interesting and detailed DVD. And it includes a section there by a famous archaeologist. This archaeologist is named David Rohl, R-O-H-L. David Rohl, from England. But when he was 7 years old, his parents had him studying hieroglyphics in Egypt. Kind of a rare situation. And he has been a historian and Egyptologist all his life. And he has a very strong position. If you ever remember seeing Cecil B. DeMille's The Exodus, or I guess it was called The Exodus. Anybody remember seeing that? Never seen that? Anyhow, Cecil B. DeMille did the Exodus, and it was so popular that after a certain number of years, he did it again, you know, a new version of it. And I don't want to lose my train of thought here. David Rohl. David Rohl says that when Cecil B. DeMille said that the Pharaoh of the Exodus was Ramses II, the most powerful pharaoh of Egyptian history, he got it wrong. They've got the Exodus in the wrong time period. If you want to put the Exodus at 1250 BC, you're not going to find any evidence for it. But if you want to put it at 1450 BC, overwhelming evidence for it. Of course, God is always testing us. He's not going to, he always tests our faith. We have experiences, right, that test us. And I notice in Jesus' teaching, he's always testing. He gives a parable, but it always has a twist to it. He's asking us to step out in faith. He's asking us to raise the bar all the time. Well, anyhow, one final reference. Now, also, let's see, what time is it? It's about 5 of 8, I think. Is that right? Yeah. Yeah. How many minutes can you guys stand going before we quit tonight? 5, 10, 15?
5.
5?
At least.
I understand. Now, remember, tonight is preliminary, biblical worldview. The big issue is biblical dispensationalism. I'm sure a lot of you are dispensationalists. I've been a dispensationalist for 70 years. So I fully know the position of traditional dispensationalism. It's a good thing. But biblical dispensationalism is different from traditional dispensationalism. Traditional dispensationalism is good. It has a lot of good to it. But biblical dispensationalism is better, more challenging, more practical, and absolutely essential for every Christian. And that'll be Sunday night. But I guess Jacob's well. I think that's a wonderful story. So much of the Bible is so clear. Here we have a picture of a man walking from Judea down to Galilee. And he has to walk through Samaria. And he comes to a little town called Sychar. And there's a well there. This is a historic well. This well was dug by Jacob and given as a gift to Joseph. And this man, heat of the day, comes and sits down by this well. Here comes a woman with a heavy water jar to get water from the well. She comes there every day. Now the woman is a Samaritan. Samaritans have no, what would you say, what's a good word?
They don't have dealings.
Yeah, with Jews. We have, in the first 2,000 years of the Bible, Gentiles. Then we have Jews. Then we have Samaritans. Now we have, 196 nations in the world, all different. A lot of them hate each other. But the hatred between Jews and Gentiles, anti-Semitism, is something really big. And it's been here a long time. Holocaust. Oh, by the way, I just want to throw this in here. Do you know that you know what a genocide is, right? A genocide is when a people are, as a people, murdered, put to death. It's interesting to me. I've heard over the years of the Armenian genocide. How many people have heard of the Armenian genocide? One of the most interesting things about our world today, and we need to start kind of finishing up, is that with the rise of Islam, people are confused about what Muslims are called down through history. Like, for example, you've heard of the Ottomans, right? The Ottoman Empire. But how many people know that Ottomans is just another term for an Islamic empire? The Ottomans were all Islamic. Lost my train of thought again. Isn't that something? So we know we're getting very close to the end here, but what in the world? Oh, yeah, I got it. How many of you know that there's a genocide going on in 2018? A genocide. How many of you know that? You've heard of that? It's not very well known. But there's a whole area that's being cleansed of Christians. Iraq, Syria, Egypt, Turkey. Christians are being martyred in these countries just because they're Christians. And it's all being done exclusively by Muslims. Now, when we say that we believe in freedom of religion and freedom of conscience, we mean that we recognize anybody's right to be whatever they believe as far as a religion is concerned. But we're not saying, like American leadership in Congress is saying, and has been saying for a long time, that all religions are good or equal. And there was just some legislation in the last couple of weeks that the question before the court was, would such and such a law favor Christianity over any other religion? And if it does, that's illegal. But when we look back on our history, which group of people helped us found our nation and develop our culture? Jack, what do you think?
Christians. People.
Christians, that's right. Pilgrims,
Yeah.
the Puritans, and Christians of all sorts. So there's no bias if we favor our Christian heritage. We come across, I'll end with this because it's going to come up later. One of the key factors in building a worldview to help us is something that God has given us, every one of us, and that is a conscience and common sense, native common sense, good judgment, just like is presented very forcefully in the book of Proverbs, for example. Now, since I've already put my foot squarely in my mouth about certain things I've already said, I'll just go to the whole link there. Common sense. How would common sense apply to this sort of a situation? In a Muslim country, you cannot build a Christian church. In a Muslim majority country, you cannot build a Christian church. If it's there, you can't repair it or renovate it or be too noisy. But in America, our government is sponsoring the massive building of mosques in America. In small town America, all across the country, in places where there are no Muslims, our nation is providing money to build mosques. And remember, right after 9/11, when the Twin Towers were taken down, there was a proposition that came up almost immediately to build a huge mosque on the site of the Twin Towers coming down. Now, as I grew up, I was a great supporter of the Bushes. They were Republicans, I was a Republican supporter. But then I tried to square with my Christian faith President Bush, the younger, saying, Islam is a great religion of peace. This is after 9/11. And Hillary saying, Islam, great religion. No, we grant freedom of religion in our thinking to anybody, be a Muslim. I know I had a nurse in recent years, and I was leaving the city, and she was saying goodbye, and she says, you know, me and my husband and I are Muslims. I never told you because I was afraid that you would, you know, hold it against me. And I said, no, I wouldn't hold it against you. Of course, I wrote her a letter later and said, don't get dragged down by that. And I've never seen her since. But part of our worldview is to assess the truth, validity, value of things. And we must, as best we can, keep our Christian culture. We should never give it up. Amen. So anyhow, tonight I had a certain hesitancy about even talking about worldview because I wanted to get into biblical dispensationalism and biblical commissions. These are the most practical things, and I feel it's information we need before we die. And so we'll be dealing with that on Sunday night and next Wednesday night. Thank you very much.